Therapeutic neutrality can mean many different things. Is that when we remain neutral, or is it something else? And when working with marginalized and AMENA populations, what themes might therapists attend to when considering ideas of therapeutic neutrality, fairness, and justice? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sen. For our Arab American Heritage series, we have the honor to be joined by Dr. Reigna El-Yashruti, a licensed clinical psychologist in Boston and received her doctorate at University of Missouri, St. Louis. Dr. Reigna specializes in working with adults with PTSD, depression, and emotional dysregulation. As part of her treatment, Dr. Reigna emphasizes the importance of understanding emotions and relationship patterns through the use of CBT, DBT, ACT, or relational techniques as a key role in her trauma-informed practice. Dr. Reigna also has practiced in diverse settings, including community mental health centers, Department of Mental Health clinics, hospital outpatient clinics, university clinics, and now she's in private practice. As an Arab Middle Eastern American psychologist, Dr. Reigna will be exploring therapeutic curiosity, neutrality, fairness, and justice within a clinical context, and recognizing the implications for marginalized or MENA clients. Dr. Reigna, thank you so much for being on this podcast and part of this special series.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
For our listeners, before we dive into the main topics, because that's a lot of concepts, right? A lot of constructs, actually.
Yeah.
Share with us a little bit about some of your clinical work right now.
Of course. So right now, as you mentioned, I have a private practice. It's a small practice that I have here based in Boston. I also work at one of the major hospitals in the Longwood medical area where I work in their outpatient psychiatry clinic. I also supervise psychiatry residents, psychology graduate students through the outpatient clinic and also through a digital psychiatry clinic. It's been quite fun.
Oh, wow. Quite a diverse milieu of activities. I should have introduced or included a supervision piece as part of the introduction, but I missed that. My apologies.
That's okay.
So let's dive into this constructs, some of these ideas that you're proposing for this particular series. One thing I want to bring up is neutrality. Are you talking about therapeutic neutrality from the psychoanalytic standpoint, or neutrality as something else?
As something else. So when I think about neutrality, it's more in the realm of how we navigate the world. From my experience, I was very drawn to being neutral and logical as the best way to be, right? Is if you have all the information, you can approach it from a very, I'm going to use the word analytic, but it's not psychoanalytic, right? It's the way we think about logical reasoning. And that was promoted as the best way to be because that's going to give you the clearest conclusion. And as I've had my lived experiences, as I've gone through my training, I realized that when we do that, when we cut out the emotional component, we're missing an entire source of information. And so I often talk about this in supervision and with clients as well, but this idea that our emotions are information sources, that when we attend to them, we can come to conclusions that are thoughtful, that are informed, and not neutral. Right? It is okay to pick a side. It is okay to reject something. It is okay to embrace something else. Being neutral isn't always the best way forward.
Now, being neutral, I am actually thinking about this too, because this is a great conversation. You're talking about cognitive, like rational, like logic neutrality as opposed to emotion, because it's almost as though emotions aren't neutral in itself.
They're not. Yeah, they're absolutely not. And this is something that comes very much out of the DBT tradition, where we have the emotion mind, which is where all the emotions live. It's all the feelings, the experiences, and then you have the logical or the rational mind. And within DBT, we talk about finding the middle path, where we're listening to both and making an informed decision about what is that middle path to move forward in.
you're synthesizing the information from the emotional brain in addition to the logic brain to find this middle path.
Yeah, very much
Ah,
so.
and that's more of the middle path, not necessarily neutrality.
Yes.
Got
Yeah.
it. Got it. Okay. So I actually wanted to jump in when you said you were taught or told the sort of logic approach is the best way. Oh, may I ask by whom? By what influences?
Mm. There were a number of specific people, but I think also socially, there was a lot of stigma about somebody who is overly emotional, right? Even if we think about traditional gender stereotypes, women are quote unquote hysterical or whatever it is that, if you have too many expressed emotions, you're dismissed as not stable or not grounded, and you can't be a good leader. You can't, there are a lot of things that you're restricted from because of your emotions, or you're looked down on because of your emotions. And I really internalized that, especially being a woman. I didn't want to be seen as that. So I wanted to be seen as somebody who had something to offer, who was grounded, who maybe was intelligent. And I didn't want my emotions to get in the way of that.
Oh gosh. Yeah. It's like really trying to fight against a part of who you are because
Mm-hmm.
of these ideals that's been laid out to you. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, tell us a little bit more about therapeutic curiosity in the context of working with marginalized or MENA clients.
I will also say that as I was thinking about curiosity and how to talk about it, I'm very aware that I'm speaking right now from a place of, you know, a fair amount of privilege and comfort, right? I'm sitting in my apartment. I have, heating. I have a cup of coffee with me. I have water. I just had lunch. I can sit and explore this idea of curiosity and say, well, let's approach things with curiosity. Let's, look at this and think about what it means. I'm not in survival mode right now. And it's not to say that you can't do it when you are in survival mode. I think you can. It just takes a lot more effort and energy. But I want to name that right now I'm not in survival mode, and that's why I can lean so heavily on this curiosity piece or talk about it, saying, this is a way to move forward. This is a way to be informed or thoughtful.
Well, actually, thank you for laying that out because too often, if when we talk about cultural humility and culturally informed practice, being curious is a key component.
Mm,
However, you actually brought up something so practical that I think people don't acknowledge, or just because of how we do things. If we are bombarded by threat, it is very difficult to be curious.
hmm
And there's that, like you said, you're sitting in an apartment. I am as well, just sitting in a safe space. So it's easier for us.
Yeah, curiosity, I really do see as the foundation of getting to know somebody and to getting to step into their world. Part of the way I was trained as a therapist was to step into the client's world, right? And this is where we talk about empathy, and empathy is difficult and also incredibly useful. You can learn to suspend your reality to step into somebody else's mind. And once you do that, once you approach things from that lens, you can understand why they do things. You can understand why they want what they want, even if those things differ from you or from even your value system. You can still work within their value system. I encourage clients to be curious about their emotions and think about, what are your emotions telling you, right? Why are you feeling sad? Why are you feeling afraid or anxious? What is the thing in the environment, or what is the thought that's going on that's activating that emotion? And then what do you want to do as a response to the emotion? And so once we get curious, we can stop judging ourselves, saying, oh, this is good, this is bad. We can think about it as, hey, this is a data point. What do I do with this data point?
Hmm.
It's very empowering. I think curiosity is empowering.
How can therapists think about that in a context of working with marginalized or MENA clients?
Mm. A lot of it, I think, will depend on the client, how they understand their identity. Oftentimes, especially if people have immigrated here or are first gen or even second gen, or have jumped these cultural bounds, they don't always know where their beliefs come from. They don't always understand why they're feeling certain things. I mean, I work with a lot of people who a big portion of my work is to say, well, yeah, of course you feel afraid. And the question we often ask people is, it feels really simple, but the question we often ask people is, if your friend came to you with the same experience, what would you tell them? Would you judge them? Would you have that same criticism? And very often that slight shift of, it's not me, it's another person, completely changes how they feel about it. And they respond very differently. So they might feel anxious or overwhelmed and then judge themselves, saying, well, why can't I just handle more? Why can't I not be upset at this? But if you say, well, if your friend came to you, or somebody that you love came to you and told you this, would you expect them to not be bothered? And they immediately jump to, well, of course not. I would comfort them. Like, okay, well, what is it about ourselves that we have such a hard time comforting ourselves, or recognizing that maybe it's okay that we're not carrying more or doing more? Maybe we can seek out some comfort.
Yeah. Like, why are we not doing more? And I'm thinking about some of our previous episodes, particularly with BIPOC clients and MENA clients. There's so much guilt for even taking the position of, I guess taking time for oneself to even reflect, taking time for oneself to not judge. I need to keep going. And tell me a little bit more about the fairness piece within, again, the therapeutic context.
Mm. So fairness and justice, I think, are really interesting concepts. There's a cartoon that has floated around the internet for I don't know how long, but it's where there's three people looking over a fence, and there's the different levels of blocks, like different heights, to make it so that everybody can see over the fence, right? And then there's a different version of the cartoon where everybody has the same block, but because people are of different heights, some people can see, some people can't. And the idea is, when we talk about equality and we assume that everybody's coming from the same starting point, that doesn't actually work out well, because people don't come from the same starting point, right? With that cartoon, people of different heights, which is normal. If we don't pay attention to those differences, if we give everybody that same equal height block, we're not actually serving everybody fairly. And it's a cartoon that's been around for a long time. It's a concept that's been around for as far as I can remember. So it's definitely not original to me. And I knew about it academically, I knew about it logically, I understood it. But the experience of it really hit me much more intensely in graduate school and then in my clinical work. And because I worked with people who were from marginalized communities, who had very different lived experiences than my own, or than anybody I knew, I could see and really have that emotional connection to what does it mean for somebody who is being treated equally but unfairly, or what does it mean to treat somebody fairly or with the sense of justice.
Hmm. I've seen that cartoon, and we'll link it in our show notes as well, so people can take a look at that. Yeah, such a profound cartoon, because there's been so many different iterations to describe different concepts, and like, especially when it comes to like equity, because to demonstrate, well, you could be so-called fair or equal, but it's not truly equity. So, in working with many BIPOC clients or marginalized clients, we're also thinking about this month in April for Arab American Heritage Series, taking together these concepts. What would you like to share with our listeners, most of whom are therapists, things that they can take away with, especially when they are maybe working with a MENA client, or noticing that some of their MENA clients are reaching, or they're seeing MENA clients for the first time?
I think what comes to mind for me is, knowing that right now, a lot of the Arab world, the Middle East, there's a lot going on, and it is, geographically removed from where we are in the States, but it's not emotionally removed for a lot of people. And, what we had talked about, like we're not in survival mode. We have this privilege of being able to expend energy on being curious. The clients that we're working with who are coming from that world or who still have connections in that world may present as having that same privilege, and they may emotionally be tied up and consumed in survival mode. So there may be a dichotomy between how they're presenting in session and what they're feeling internally. And ideally in therapy, that comes out, right? Therapy is a space where we can be our full selves, where we can show all sides of us. That doesn't always happen in the therapy room. And I do think it's on the therapist, or it's the responsibility of the therapist to name what's going on, to make space for it and say that this is a place where, we can explore that difference, that dichotomy, that, you're physically safe, but you're emotionally in survival mode.
Yeah. So again, just given the complexities of what's going on, I do think it's important for therapists to really, really be exploratory with our marginalized clients and MENA clients. Can you tell me a little bit more, or is there anything else you want to add, or can you tell me more about implementing these concepts of therapeutic curiosity, fairness, and justice within marginalized and MENA clients?
Mm. I think it's important to recognize that we think of the therapy space as a place where people are going to come in and be open and talk about everything, and that therapist is going to help the client digest the information and move forward. And even in spaces that feel safe, like we want to create that environment, people may be hesitant to share certain bits of information because it might impact them directly, or it might not even impact them, but it might impact somebody that they love or somebody that they're connected to. And while we as therapists know that this is a space that has like the ultimate protections, that's not everybody's lived experience, right? They've been in places that they thought were safe and protected, and they've had things sort of go sideways, or they've had what they've said used against them. And not just against them, but against people that they love. And so that makes them hesitant, that may make them hesitant to engage with the system, to engage with us as therapists. And we bear the responsibility, again, of making that space safe, but also only promising what we can promise.
Yeah.
Right? Not over promising.
Yeah. Yeah. We practice, we see a lot of clients, and, we go through the confidentiality statement and so forth. I think the part that, you're also pointing out explicitly is we are practicing within a system. So if our records get subpoenaed, we follow these type of
Right.
systems. And it's also important to note here that particularly with our, with clients who are marginalized and from MENA populations, trust isn't a one-time deal. It's constant. So, Dr. Reina, anything else you want to add?
One thing that comes to mind is that people who are visible minorities are, by virtue of them being a visible minority, they are not as represented in society. And so that can make people feel like they have to represent the entire culture. And so any exploration into their culture or identity or values can be seen as a betrayal of their identity or their culture of origin, or that they're caving to the dominant culture. They're sort of losing their sense of self.
Like I have to explain this to you.
It's sort of like if I explore, a different, being a different way than what my culture of origin tells me, or what the culture I'm representing tells me, then I'm not being true to who I am. I'm losing myself and becoming part of this other identity.
Yes. Yes. Mm.
And it's not always safe to do that. Right?
Yeah. I'm also thinking about developmental phases where there's part of us where we want to seek a sense of belonging. And
Mhm.
when our identity is more closely aligned to, say, our immediate cultural ethnic identity, it feels safe. And yet when we explore spaces that are different for us, although it's the norm, we're speaking more so in the US,
Mhm.
it does feel like I'm pulling away from my my home, if you will, my central, my core being, and it is a betrayal. Gosh, what am I doing? When especially the external world, the so-called dominant representation, has not really been nice, has not really been kind.
Mhm.
So there is that tension there.
Yeah, very much so. And that betrayal is it's even sharper when there's been some sort of sacrifice made, right? If I think about the families I work with who where the person, the client is an immigrant or the client is a first generation. There's usually a sacrifice that's been made or some sort of very difficult experience of leaving home, wherever home is or whatever that means for people. And so for them to be exploring stepping away from that further, it feels like a betrayal of the sacrifice or not being
Not being true.
not being true.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Another thing, if I can shift just slightly
Mhm.
abruptly, another thing that does come up, I think, with in my work with marginalized populations and MENA in general, is the people often have a sense of I should be doing more. It kind of ties into this idea of betrayal, right? We don't want to engage in betrayal, so I have to have a reason. I have to have a reason for the sacrifice to have been made. And so often people will come into the therapy room and they say, well, you know, I should be able to take on more. Why am I so overwhelmed? Why am I so anxious? And a lot of our work ends up untangling that belief of I should be able to do more, kind of with should in
Mhm.
quotes, especially when these individuals do tend to be doing a lot, right? They're caring for families, they're holding down one or two jobs, they're trying to exercise and socialize and work on their professional networking, all the things that they're quote unquote supposed to be doing, and they're exhausted and they're frustrated. And we really explored, well, I almost wonder, what do you expect to be able to take on? What do you think where's this should? What should you be able to take on? And, clients will refer back and say, well, so and so is, seems like they have it together. Or my grandparents used to be able to do this. They worked so much harder. And I think that's fair to some degree. There's always somebody we can look at that seems to be doing more. But I ask my clients, at what cost? Right? What was the unseen cost of all of that? When we overwork ourselves physically, our body will tell us, you have to stop. If you don't want to stop, I'm going to make you stop. Right? We get sick. All sorts of stuff happen. Same is true of our emotional capacity. We're emotionally exhausted. Our bodies will tell us to stop. And so, there are hidden costs to taking on more that it would probably serve us better if we paid attention to what those hidden costs are and thinking even if the other people that we're idolizing, even if we don't have access to them, wondering if they were given a choice, would they do as much as they did?
Ooh, that is such a great question. If given a choice, would you have done what you did? Or if given a choice, how much would you have taken on? And so there is this nuance here with marginalized and MENA populations to think about how, if you're seeing your clients doing all these things, right? All these achievement driven activities,
Mhm.
to question, why is this? What's the purpose? And also paying attention to potential betrayal, like to justify why I need to be doing this, uh,
Mhm.
as well as the guilt of leaving, say, the identity, or I'm leaving, or the guilt of, well, there are others who are struggling, and essentially minimizing um, the experience here today. So I need to do more.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
finding that balance, right? That discomfort is information. We can use that to motivate us, maybe to take on some more, but we can also just let it be. We can recognize what our limit is and tolerate that discomfort, that guilt.
So how did you get here? How did you get into this work? Share with us any
Well,
memorable events or circumstances that influenced how you got here.
yeah, that was a whole journey and a half. I didn't know that I wanted to do psychology. It was sort of a by accident, maybe not by accident. It was more of a wandering experience where, as an undergrad, I had to pick a major and I kind of went through all of these different majors, and I was like, okay, I like psychology enough. I'm gonna see what it's like to do an undergrad degree in it. And then I finished that. I liked it. I enjoyed my classes. I did well even when I wasn't crazy about the professors, and that was usually a good sign. Like, okay, I'm invested in this field. And then I did a master's degree at NYU. And I was actually more interested initially in research. And I was like, no, I want nothing to do with clinical psychology. That's not for me. And I think it was largely because I didn't understand what clinical psychology actually was. And so I do this master's degree. I get some exposure to what research looks like. And I'm like, okay, actually, I want nothing to do with psychology. I'm going to try something completely different. And I did end up working in a very different field for briefly, a little bit of time. I was worked in PR for a little bit. And then through that work, I realized like, okay, I got some time away and realized that I found psychology quite fulfilling. And it was something that I really wanted to go back to. So I did spend a couple of years coming back to psychology because I couldn't, wasn't going to be able to just jump right back in. And I had already reached that level academically where the next step, and really the only step for me, if I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, was going to be a doctorate.
Hmm.
And
May
so
I
I
ask
needed, yes,
your first master's? May I ask your first master's? What was it in?
that was general psychology.
General
It
psych.
was, it
Okay.
was a terminal general psychology
Got
degree.
it. Okay.
It was a great place for me to explore what I wanted to do. Because initially I went in thinking I wanted research and maybe specifically neuroscience research or neuropsych research. And then through that program, I realized that wasn't quite what I was looking for.
Mm.
Yeah. Once I discovered or figured out that actually I really like the idea of clinical psychology, I want to explore it further. That's when I looked at grad programs, at doctorate programs. And of course, having been out of the field for so long, I needed to get back into it. So I spent a couple of years building myself back into the world of psychology. And as you mentioned, I attended UMSL, the University of Missouri St. Louis. And I initially I was looking only at trauma-focused programs because, being from the Middle East, that's something that's so prominent. And a lot of the research that we do is trauma-oriented, or at least, the very least, trauma-informed. And so that's what I wanted to really focus on. And UMSL is very trauma, or at least at the time that I was there, really was very trauma oriented. But I was in the multicultural lab. And so I got this intersection of, multicultural everything, theory, practice, ideas, mixed in with that trauma focused program. And that was really quite a transformative experience. I'm deeply grateful for many of the colleagues and friends that I have now that came from that program.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Reigna, as a person of color, what were some challenges that you faced and overcame that you will be willing to share?
It's an interesting question for me because I know your listeners can't see me, but I sometimes present as a white person. I am considered white passing. And, I'm ethnically Arab, but I have lighter skin. I sound the way that I sound. And so people don't always know where to place me. And so I don't think that I've had the same challenges that somebody who has a very clear, visible difference does. It has come up in some arenas. There's this one example I remember in a classroom where I was with, a few different peers from different backgrounds, but when I would offer a response to a professor, it was kind of dismissed or seen as maybe not quite relevant or missing the mark a little bit. And then my friend in the class, who was a white male from the area, would offer almost the same response. And his response was praised as being, so thoughtful, so on the mark, so relevant. And it was confusing at first. I later debriefed with my friends, with that peer who was also, very close to me. And it's something that happened repeatedly. And I realized that, this was an uncomfortable situation where because I didn't frame things in exactly the way the dominant person or culture did, it was not seen as relevant. And luckily, the person who the peer, the classmate was a friend of mine. And we kind of turned it into this running joke where every time I'd say something in class that got dismissed, he would pipe up with almost the same thing. And then we'd laugh about it afterwards. And That's a very small experience, but I know that other people who are more visibly different have that experience very, very frequently. And so I think it's important to name as a regular thing that does happen.
Yeah. And may I ask, when you say mentioned when you would state something and it was perceived as off the mark, was it the same statement? And it's like the way I hear you describe it, it seems as though you had to reframe it to make it relevant. What I guess what I'm trying to get at here is it's almost as though as your peer didn't even have to bother about a reframing.
That's what it felt like. That is very much what it felt like sometimes,
Wow.
where just because came from a different voice, it was received differently.
Okay. As you had experienced these challenges where your voices wasn't recognized or your ideas weren't recognized, and I take it that this happened regularly, how did you cope with being overshadowed by other people's perspectives or voices?
I was really lucky to have a great community that was supportive. So even if in that particular classroom there was a hierarchy, there was a place where kind of I was dismissed, I had other spaces that I was very supported, where people recognized what was going on, where peers, professors had had similar experiences or worse, and there was some validation that this was a system that I couldn't necessarily change. I didn't have the power to change. Those professors didn't necessarily have the power to change. And what got me through it was the support. And that's where I think community is so powerful. Sometimes we can't change things and they are uncomfortable and unfair, and we can still get through it. We can tolerate it when we have that community.
So, a recommendation in thinking back to your experience, what helped you survive those times was seeking that community, searching it out. Because we do get caught up when we assume there is no one else out there.
Mm.
And I think you took the leap of faith by saying, I need to go search out community.
Yes, and there were also certain people who sought me out. And this is a recommendation I have to people in general. If you have that ability to notice things, if you can create those spaces for people, seek them out, ask them like, "Hey, do you need support right now? Can I saw this happen. Is this weird for you too?" Having other people ask me and check in with me was really helpful.
Wow. And for you, what does it mean to be an Arab American psychologist? And for you, what does it mean to be an Arab American psychologist?
But for me, it's very much about being a bridge. I'm very proud of my Arab identity, and my full ethnic identity is Arab, but culturally, I'm a mix between Arab and American. And I think it's an ongoing conversation, even to now, right? It's an ongoing conversation in my brain about which part is more prominent in which settings, at which points of time in my life, or during which roles I'm in the moment. And so for me, being that bridge is a wonderful experience. I love having that diversity basically built into my life. I've been fortunate that I have always been almost forced to see things from different perspectives, or to hold multiple truths that at the surface level seem incongruent or inconsistent, but when you go deeper, they really do exist together. You can have joy and despair, and you can have beauty and pain, and you have all these things mixed in together. You have freedom, independence, and connection and community, and these things can coexist. And so for me, being an Arab American psychologist has allowed me to experience those things and then be very aware of it and bring it to others as well.
Hmm. You see a broader landscape and you experience a broader landscape. And when you
Mhm.
say to bring that experience to others, tell me more about that.
I love being with people who are different, right? People who've had different experiences, people who are curious about my differences. It feels so rich, where you can talk and ask questions. Say, why do you see things that way? Why is this important to you? What's the downside of this? Why is this better? Why is this more effective? Those conversations challenge me, and I like that challenge, right? It's not in a threatening way, it's in a curious way.
Yeah. It really does make life richer to
Mhm.
have those conversations. More depth.
Painting. Yeah,
Yeah.
painting with a full color palette.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Mhm. If I can share one story that
Of
I don't know if it
course.
fits in right here, but,
Sure.
you know, a lot of times in society and when we talk about power and people who have power, there's this sort of deference to them, like, "Oh my god, they can do no wrong," or "They're infallible." And I had that same belief system, and I can't help but feel sometimes that difference comes up, and I might feel inferior, or I feel scared, or I feel hesitant. And I remember a moment that happened to me after I got my doctorate degree. I had just gone through this whole program. It was very intense. I was really proud that I had finished this whole thing. And I'm Dr. Reigna El-Yashruti. And I was walking in my house somewhere and I like stumbled or like walked into the wall. Like I hit my shoulder on the wall and I started laughing because I was just clumsy, right? I was just a clumsy person. And in my mind, I'm like, if a doctor, am walking into a wall, maybe all these other people are also just walking into walls, right? Maybe they're just people too. And I keep holding on to that. I think it's important to remember that, yes, people who have power do absolutely have power. And there's all sorts of things that we have to pay attention to, whether they have, you know, whatever power they have over us, it is important to pay attention to. And they are human. We are human. It's important to remember that we all have something to offer. And the more that we listen to each other, the more that we get curious about what the other person has to offer, the better we will all be. I mean, that's how we lift each other up as a community. It's listening to everyone. We don't have to embrace or accept every idea, right? This goes back to the being thoughtful and being informed, but we can listen to it and then make a decision on how to move forward.
Again, thank you for your work in exploring these constructs and ideas. And hopefully listeners, as they're listening to this episode, are actively thinking about how to use these ideas and implementing them within the therapeutic space for our marginalized clients. And Dr. Reigna, thank you so much for being on our show.
Of course. Thank you for having me. And thank you for having this podcast and for creating the space to lift other people's voices up. I appreciate it.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Your feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.